Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Peace be upon everyone who's watching or listening who may see this in the future. This is Kenny Bomer. I am the author of the book, Consider Islam, Disproving the Patriots Propaganda, and the forthcoming book, the upcoming book, Everything's the Test, Truth is Made Clear from Falsehood. And this is Kenny Bomer Live on Consider This TV, where truth is made clear from falsehood. So alhamdulillah, I'm going to have a discussion today with a Christian friend of mine by the name of Alan Kincaid Manning.
Kincaid?
And, I don't know what the K stands for. So I just Alan Kenny Manning. I don't know what the K stands for.
How about you can call me Abdullah Khalid Manning?
Okay, so whatever the heck A.K. Manning stands for, we're going to be talking today about pagan influence on Judaism, and we may go into the topic of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his prophethood. We'll see if we get there to that discussion. We have a limited time. But I do encourage you to give to the Kenny Bomer Foundation. I will post the link for my PayPal to this video so that you can give for my dawah efforts, inshallah. I have a lot of stuff that I'm trying to work on that's coming up, and I could certainly use the help in that regard. And it is a blessing for you as well to give for the cause of dawah. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that for the person who helps the da'i financially or otherwise, he receives the blessings that the da'i received without the blessings of the da'i being diminished in the least. So you receive the blessings even if you're not doing the actual footwork itself. So I do encourage you to give to the Kenny Bomer Foundation for the Dawah Fund so that we can proceed with trying to build this particular platform and try to do some things that we're wanting to do as far as trying to get some water wells built in Ghana and other places throughout the world where water is scarce. So, Alan Kincaid Manning, as I called him, I don't know what the K stands for. I always call him A.K. Manning. But we've been dealing with one another via social media for over 3 years at this point. I do have love for this individual. I do have a lot of respect for him. And we have been going round and around and around about Christianity and Islam for over 3 years at this point. It did start here on Facebook, and it has progressed from there. We talk nearly on a daily basis via phone, and we always talking about the issues, the most prevalent issues that matter to mankind, all centered around our God, our Creator, and our different views about who our Creator is, and all centered around what transpires on the Day of Judgment. So today we're going to be talking about pagan influence on Judaism, and I'm going to allow A.K. Manning to actually start and introduce himself and give him the floor first because he does not believe there's been an influence from our conversation yesterday. He does not believe that Judaism has been influenced by paganism, and the reason I stated that fact yesterday is because not only has Judaism been influenced by paganism, but the effects of paganism influencing Judaism inevitably wound up affecting Christianity. And so that is a fact that we're going to discuss, and I will prove that as we proceed, inshallah. I do ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts my efforts to share the truth and the beauty of Islam and truth in general. I do bear witness there's no God other than Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is his final servant, the seal of our prophets. Any mistakes that I make are my own mistakes, and I will try to correct those if need be along the way. At some point, I'll try to correct those. But any good that comes is only from our Creator, and all glory and praise and honor goes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our one true God. So with that said, A.K. Manning, take the floor and introduce yourself, and at some point, whenever you're ready to begin the argument itself, I'm going to give you however long you think you need. I thought initially we'd go 5-minute segments, but it's up to you. I'll let you talk as long as you need to, and then we'll proceed from there. So go ahead.
That's kind of you, Kenny. I appreciate it. I'm assuming that most of your audience is Muslim, and so to them I say assalamu alaikum. May the grace and peace of the one true and living God be with you. I identify that God is Yahweh, who is eternally triune, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Although hopefully we don't delve off too far into things like Trinity versus Tawhid today. We'll do that another day. I wish I had all kinds of great things I could say about myself, that I was some brilliant scholar or something like that. I'm a truck driver. I don't have any kind of college degree or anything like that. My study in theology is just my own, whatever I glean through personal study, and found Islam very interesting, although I'm not at all convinced. Kind of the genesis of this conversation, as Kenny alluded to, is that yesterday we had a conversation. He was talking about the influence of paganism in Christianity, and I said, there is some influence that the Catholic Church has had as it incorporated regional beliefs into what they had created as a state religion, but that the original church had not been influenced by paganism. It was of Hebrew origin, and I made the assertion that in the early church, pre-Catholic Church, in the 1st and 2nd century, there would have been no pagan influence in Judaism and therefore Christianity. So Kenny's done some research, found some evidence, and I'm going to listen to it so I can be convinced otherwise.
Are you ready for that me to proceed with that now?
Bring it on.
Okay. So I'm going to be reading from my own notes on the matter, but you'll see that my notes do coincide with, matter of fact, I don't know if you can see this book here by Karen Armstrong, A History of God. Can you see this book?
Yep.
Okay. Sure. Yeah, it's written by, matter of fact, it's a New York Times bestseller, written by Karen Armstrong. I do mention Karen Armstrong in my book, Consider Islam. I have a quote from her about a different topic, but I do respect her writing. And my initial research didn't come from her book, but what I did was today I went through and I highlighted some things that coincide with the argument that I'm going to be giving. And so let's proceed. I'm going to initially set my timer for about 5 minutes. I'm going to be reading through my notes, so please bear with me as we proceed. So before I begin, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. I do bear witness there's no God other than Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the final servant, the seal of all prophets. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept my efforts to share the truth, inshallah. So as we proceed, what we're going to be talking about is syncretism. I don't know if you're familiar with the term syncretism. Are you familiar with that term, just briefly?
No.
Okay. Syncretism is a amalgamation or a combining of different religions or cultures or schools of thought that inevitably affect another religion. Okay, so it's a combination of various beliefs and different religions and cultures and schools of thought, once again, and writings and all those things that affect a particular religion or group. Okay, so it's called syncretism. And so what we have here is the effects of syncretism from pagan beliefs that have been grafted into Judaism initially and then into Christianity, and it's syncretism. So all those things have been mushed together. I always talk about macaroni and cheese. I'm not trying to be funny, but I'm just trying to look for ways to express this, where you have a box of macaroni on one side and some cheese on the other, and you mash it all together and try to make what you want, the meal that you want. But so let's get right into it. So in discussing this, we have to start with the Canaanites, and the Canaanites actually predated the Israelites by approximately 2,000 years. We find writings about them as late as 3,500 BC, as early as 3,500 BC. And so we're discussing the land of Canaan, and it was situated in the region eventually known as Israel. And it encompassed the Egyptian, the Syrian, and Hittite areas, those areas of Egypt and Syrian and the Hittites. And much of the sources of knowledge of Canaan stems from excavations that produce the Ugaritic text and other artifacts from Canaanite culture, all of which were influenced by polytheistic beliefs of the Egyptians, the Syrians, and the Hittites. And so the religion of the Israelites originated out of those Bronze Age traditions, specifically the Canaanite religion. And they exhibited a synchronization, once again, of elements of Egyptian, Canaanite, and Sumerian Babylon, and became a henotheistic offshoot. Henotheistic is defined as an adherence to one God amongst several gods. So henotheistic, you believe in ultimately one God that is above a series of other so-called gods or other gods.
That's pretty close.
Yeah. So stemming from the Canaanite worship of the god El, Elyon, Olam, El Shaddai, El Sabaoth, El Du Yahweh Sabaoth. That's another god, El Du Yahweh Sabaoth, and Yahweh Elohim, which is a plural, Yahweh Elohim, meaning the Lord of hosts. So El Supreme, El is the god El, These are all different gods that I just named. And so the god El is supposedly a supreme god of Mesopotamian Semites, who later became the chief god of the Hebrew Bible, known as the father or ruler of divines, rather. And he had a wife that was named Asherah, and also sons Baal Hadad, Mat, Yam, and Ashtar. And he was known, once again, the god El was known as the creator, and the god of the Jews eventually and gradually evolved from El, who was the high god of the Canaanites. He became eventually the Israelite El, the chief god of the Hebrews. And so they had essential qualities that were comparable, right? So the essential qualities of Canaanite El were retained in the God of Hebrews mentioned in the Bible, and particularly in Genesis 21:33. You might want to write that down, where we see the name El Olam mentioned. Also in Genesis 17:1, El Shaddai. Also Deuteronomy 32:8, we see El Elyon, which means the Most High, which also originally means the sons of God. In modern translations, it's been changed to the sons of Israel, but initially it meant sons of God, and it's been changed in modern translations to sons of Israel. So over time, the Israelite group of Canaanites converged to the sky gods of Baal and Baal Hadad, and El was conflated as Yahweh. So if you understand what I just said, so eventually these gods of the so-called sky gods, you'd have to have knowledge of the sky gods, Baal Hadad, and El. They were actually conflated eventually over a period of time in becoming the god Yahweh. So early Israelites worshiped Yahweh, and also, so once again, remember, the early Israelites, they worshiped Yahweh and his wife Asherah, who was the consort of El in the Canaanite tradition. So El is the oldest of all the gods. He's the father of years. He's the head of divine council, and Asherah was his main wife and mother of other gods. So El became known as the father of Adam and the ruler of the universe and supreme authority, and supreme authority, and he was full of grace and compassion. So over time, the concept of monolatry, I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but monolatry was accepted by worshiping one God while not denying the existence of others. So we have monotheism, we also have monolatry, which is the belief in one ultimate God, worshiping one certain God. Matter of fact, it doesn't even have to be an ultimate God. It was the worship of one God in particular out of a group of many. That's called monolatry, okay? So the Israelites focused on, in this monolatry, the Israelites focused on El Yahweh, and it compelled them to make it appear as though there was a greater divide between Yahweh, the El Yahweh, and the older god of Baal. Okay, so they were trying to create this division and not allow the influence to be recognizable. So they were trying to create distance between these two gods. So they went to great lengths in the Hebrew text to make conflict between Yahweh and Baal. And they try to make that very apparent in the Bible itself. As a matter of fact, we'll address that. So this marks the trend of Israel rejecting its heritage, and they eventually disassociated themselves from Canaanite traditions, but the essential elements of influence were still maintained. So in the Bible, an example of this is the dwellings of El. In Isaiah 14:13, El resides on Mount Zaphon, and in the same text, he dwells within a tent, like the tabernacle described in Exodus. So titles of Canaanite El were preserved in Hebrew tradition, Elion, which means the Most High, and also Toru, which is bull. And also Hadakuka, which means God of the patriarchs, and Gibar, which is a warrior, and Olam is the eternal, is an eternal God. Olam means eternal. So all names of Canaanite El, which became names, all of these names of Canaanite El eventually became names for the Hebrew El. And so with that being said, we talk about the word Babel in regards to Babylon. So it's a conjunction between the word Bab and El, meaning the gate of the God, meaning Babel is referred to as gate of the God. Originally, Baal and Yahweh had a peaceful coexistence. Remember, I said that they were trying to create a division so that you don't see the elements of that pagan influence. So, but originally, Baal and Yahweh had a peaceful coexistence, but that was eventually rejected, and we see signs of that in Judges chapter 6 and chapter 32. Also, 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 21. Also, 1 Chronicles 8:33, 2 Samuel 2:8, and 1 Chronicles 8:34. And I can repeat those back to you at any point if you need. So, as Israelites tried to distance themselves, they were trying to distance themselves. So Baal Hadad was eventually substituted for the Israel Yahweh. We also get the word Adonai. We get that from this early pagan influence. Originally it meant Lord. It also equals the name Baal. So the word Adonai equals the word Lord, which also equals the word Baal. They all mean the same thing. These are synonymous words and synonymous terms. So there's a connection. The connection there is undeniable due to the narrative, the instances in which these are actually utilized. Matter of fact, we see signs of that in Psalm 104, also Exodus 32:8, where it says, "These are your sons." Excuse me. It says in Exodus 32:8, it says, "These are your gods, O Israel." Also in Psalm 29 makes reference, and we see the influence of assimilation of religions surrounding it in those texts. So in numerous passages, Yahweh is depicted as any previous storm god. Okay, so there were previous storm gods, and we see that same thing mentioned in the Old Testament. Okay, so numerous passages. Once again, Yahweh is depicted as any previous storm god. The parallels are there. So the most notable being Baal Hadad. Once again, and like Baal, Yahweh was known to be is a warrior who descends from a particular mountain, and he resides on chariots of clouds. And his voice is like thunder, and his weapon is lightning, and the earth quakes, and skies release rain at his command, and he defeats the seas by his command, and becomes ruler of the skies. And we see that in regards to Yahweh being a warrior, we see that reference in Exodus 15:3, and also Numbers 23:22. We see El being bringing people out of Egypt, and it says, matter of fact, it says El brings them out of Egypt, and is for them horns of a wild bull. Once again, Baal was known for that symbolism of a wild bull as well. Numbers 24:8, it says, and I quote, "Like horns of a bull, devour nations and foes, break bones and cast arrows." So it's saying that El, inevitably Yahweh, another word name for Yahweh in the Bible, El and Yahweh coincide. So, like horns of a bull, devour nations and foes, and break bones and cast arrows. We see the same parallel once again in the words of Baal. So the El of the Canaanites, once again, is also called a bull and a warrior, as I had mentioned. So parallels of Baal and Yahweh, as attested in Ugaritic literature of Baal cycle in the Hebrew Bible. So here's a comparison. In the Ugaritic Baal cycle, it says, and this is what it says in their text. It says, "Let me tell you, Prince Baal, let me repeat, rider of clouds. Now your enemy, Baal, now your enemy will."
Kenny, sorry, give me like 20 seconds. I gotta go turn off an alarm. It's almost 2 o'clock.
Okay, sure. Okay. Alhamdulillah. So as we're waiting, please give to the Kenny Bomer Foundation so we can continue to do our dawah efforts, and we can work on some other projects that we're trying to get done to get some water wells built and those things. So I will post the link to this video, inshallah, God willing, and I pray that Allah blesses you for your willingness to give. And if you can't give, then please just give us your prayers and make dua for us so that we can pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses our efforts and accepts our efforts, inshallah.
Okay, I'm back.
Okay, you're back? Okay, so I'm gonna pick up where I was talking about the parallels between the Ugaritic Baal cycle. These are Ugaritic texts of the pagans prior to the Hebrew Bible that was written. But notice the parallels in what's being stated. You can see where the Hebrew Bible has actually borrowed directly from the pagan writings. Okay, so it says, "Let me tell you, Prince Baal, let me repeat, rider of clouds. Now your enemy, Baal, now you will kill your enemy, annihilate your foe, and take your eternal kingship. Your dominion is forever." In the Hebrew Bible, it says, "Behold your enemies, Yahweh. Behold your enemies perish. All evildoers are scattered," in Psalm 92:10. And also in Psalm 145, verses 1 through 3, it says, "Your dominion is an eternal kingship. Your dominion is forever eternal." Also in Exodus 19:16 through 8, both of these gods are revealed on a mountain. As a matter of fact, that's evident in Exodus 19:16 through 8. So Baal's theophany is described the same way, as being revealed on a mountain. It says, "Then Baal opened a break in the clouds and sounded his holy voice, and thundered from his lips, and earth's high places shook." And so we see that same reference being made in the book of Exodus once again. Okay, so the storm god comparison is echoed in Judges 5:45 and also Psalm 104:3, where we see direct parallels to the storm god reference, and the shared emphasis on the seventh day. As a matter of fact, there's a shared emphasis regarding the seventh day. So Baal intercedes on the seventh day. Baal intercedes for Daniel during his incubation rite in the temple. And also on the seventh day, Yahweh called to Moses in Exodus 24:16. Once again, they both have a place on a mountain in which they reside. They both are storm gods, and they both do a particular task on the seventh day. So you see the influence, you see the parallels there. And once again, as I mentioned, over a period of time, the Hebrews tried to disassociate themselves with those original influence. So, in regards to circumcision, in Genesis 17, it says every male should be circumcised, which is a connection to Egyptian culture, with the earliest record coming from the tomb of Saqqara, dating back to 2400 BC. So this whole circumcision issue was already existing in pagan beliefs long before we had this in Genesis 7. So worship of the name Yahweh originated in areas south of Egypt, and it draws the Torah in that regard draws influence from other pre-existing Middle Eastern influences, predating it, adopting and modifying them. An example is the laws of the Shuna, with the whole covenant and all the law issues regarding the Old Testament and all the talk about the covenant. Well, these covenants and these laws already existed in paganism before that, in the laws of Ashuna, also Middle Assyrian laws, and Oranamu, or the Oranamu laws. So I'm going to finish up by just this last bit. So we see a covenant theme there. We see a covenant theme. We had the seventh day issue. We had the mountain issue. We have the storm god issue, and all those things. So in regards to,
hold on, I'm going to stop this. My final alarm. Hold on.
okay. 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 Okay, so once again, this is Kenny Bomer Live on Consider This TV. We're sorry for the pause, but A.K. Manning had to stop an alarm or do something. So as we proceed, we're talking about pagan influence on Judaism, which inevitably affected Christianity as well, where we see the pagan influence in Christianity with Easter and with Christmas and all those things, all the pagan.
Are you there?
Things. Yes. Okay. So I'm gonna summarize by just talking briefly.
Conference call at 2:00. It's now 2:00 Pacific time.
Okay.
And try and extend it as far as I can because we haven't really had a conversation yet. So go ahead and continue. Has it?
Okay,
did you set yourself a 5-minute timer? Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, actually, I didn't push the button. But go ahead. I'll stop there and let you respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like we've got a couple general themes, and thank you so much for letting me respond while I have very little time left. The general theme of El and Baal, right? El is the Hebrew word for God, and it may have had Canaanite origins. I haven't looked into that, but that's where you get the derivative words of Elohim and Elohenu. When you hear Beth-El, meaning house of God, and that's where we get the word Bethlehem, right? Where you hear people of God, like Elijah, the El is God. And these are contraction names that mean like servant of God and things like that. So it's broadly known that El means God in Hebrew, and linguistically that may have had Canaanite origins. I think you and I would agree on who the first man and woman were. Would you agree that that was Adam and Eve?
Yeah, I do agree. I agree with that.
Okay. And you know that their first sons were Cain and Abel, right?
Yes.
Canaanites are the people of the line of Cain. So there's two responses I have to this assertion that there's a connection, right? One is people prior to the flood lived to be over 900 years old in many cases. There's a good likelihood that Adam lived a good long time. Cain and Abel did as well. And so it's entirely feasible. It makes perfect sense to say that Cain would have heard a great deal about God from Adam. In fact, you as a Muslim would identify Adam as a prophet. So this term El for God logically could have predated Canaanite society because Cain himself would have heard about God from Adam. My second response is something that all of your listeners are very familiar with this phrase: correlation does not equal causation. Right? So if we see two things that correlate, that doesn't mean that one caused the other. If you say fire is hot and I say fire is hot, that doesn't mean you're following in the tradition of Alan or I'm following in the tradition of Kenny. We may have just both properly identified that fire is hot. And so in this case, two different cultures may have properly identified El as a good word for God. So that's my response in short.
Okay, well,
as far as Baal, that is a false god, and it is a god of the Canaanites. There are many, many false gods out there, and I have never looked into the bull symbolism and other great stuff that you brought up, so I'll look into it at some time.
Yeah, well, okay, so, yeah, I appreciate your response, but it seems that you have admitted that you're not familiar with the Canaanites and their belief in the god El. So that's something that you need to look into. If I understood what you You said
Yeah, but I mean, we're talking about the descendants of Cain, so of course they would have been informed by Adam, who you identify as a prophet.
okay. Well, yeah, absolutely. But the fact of the matter is, let me get into something that Karen Armstrong states. She says, in regards to a theory by Smith. She says Smith's theory goes in ancient times, the high god was replaced by more attractive gods of the pagan pantheons. In the beginning, therefore, there was one God, and if this is so, then monotheism was one of the earliest ideas evolved by human beings to explain the mystery and tragedy of life. And she says later still, in about 2000 BCE, the Babylonian tradition also affected the mythology of and religion of Canaan, which would become the promised land of the ancient Israelites. So if just that one statement alone, that one sentence alone, basically says exactly what I said in my opening there. This Babylonian tradition also affected the mythology and religion of Canaan, which would become the promised land of the ancient Israelites. Okay, so she goes on to say, the myth of Marduk and Tiamat seems to have influenced the people of Canaan. And I didn't mention those two myths in particular, but it goes on to say, who told a very similar story about Baal-Hadad, Baal-Habad, the god of storm and fertility, which I did mention, who is often mentioned in extremely unflattering terms in the Bible. She goes on to say Baal and Yam both lived with El. Okay, so pay close attention in regards to El. So Baal and Yam both lived with El, the Canaanite high god. At the council of El, Yam demands that Baal be delivered up to him with two magic weapons that I mentioned that Yahweh and El also, both of them have. Baal defeats Yam and is about to kill him when Ashura, El's wife and mother of the gods, pleads that it is dishonorable to slay the prisoner. And so she goes on, we're getting to Abraham here in a second, but it says the death of God, the quest of the God, the death of a god and the quest of the goddess and the triumph and return of the divine sphere were constant religious themes in many cultures and would recur in the very different religion of the one God worshipped by Jews. I didn't read that very well, so let me read that again. It says the death of a god and the quest of the goddess and the triumphant return to the divine sphere were constant religious themes in many cultures and would recur in the very different religion of the one God worshipped by the Jews. This religion is attributed in the Bible to Abraham, who left Ur and eventually settled in Canaan sometime between the 20th and 19th centuries. So if you notice what she's stating there, she's saying that these influences, they have to affect. You know, we talked yesterday about
It didn't say the influences have to affect.
Well, no, I'm saying.
What you were reading. You're saying that.
Yeah,
Well,
I don't think she said that. I'm saying anytime someone is in close proximity or you know, especially if you're being ruled by someone, then their influence is over you. There's no doubt about it. You're going to be influenced by those who are around you on a day in, day out basis, much less on a generational basis and a religious basis. You're going to be influenced in some way by the people that you're in contact with. So to assume that the Israelites weren't affected by the influence of pagans is just, it's far-fetched. We see evidence of it everywhere.
Let me ask you a question by that logic. So you're saying that without additional information, we can stand alone on this fact that if you are in proximity of people of other beliefs, they will influence you.
Absolutely.
Your beliefs.
Yes.
And so for that reason, the pagans that surrounded Muhammad's followers, we would logically say they have to have influenced Islam. Is that right?
Sure. Let me tell you how they influenced Islam, and that's a kind of a red herring, but we'll talk about that briefly.
No, I mean, I'm just asking if the same logic applies.
Yeah. Well, yes, it applies. Yeah, absolutely. The pagans' had an influence on Islam by the simple fact that those pagans insisted on worshiping false gods and deities to the point that they persecuted the Muslims and forced the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his companions to actually flee. Well,
cultural.
What I'm saying, they didn't influence them in regards to their beliefs, but the potential was there.
Oh.
Well, hold on.
Would the same apply to the Jews?
Let me clarify. The
Okay.
pagans, if the Muslims would have given in, just like prime example, alhamdulillah. So prime example, the influence that the Egyptians had over the children of Israel that were led around in the desert for 40 years by the prophet Musa alayhi salatu wasalam. So the influence of the pagans on the children of Israel wandering around in the desert was evident. It's so extreme and so torturous and so evident that they began to erect the golden calf because they wanted to go back to what was comfortable for them. The traditions had been already set in place over centuries, over decades rather, or possibly centuries, but decades for sure. So the influence was already there, which caused them to want to resort back to that, even though they were being led supposedly to the promised land by the prophet Moses, peace be upon him. So to imply that there would be no influence of some other belief system in regards to the pagans in particular on any other religion, any of the three Abrahamic faiths is just, it's you know, I don't see where you have any foundation and basis for making such a claim when we see evidence of it. We see evidence of it in the Bible itself.
What theological influence has paganism had on Islam?
Well, you know, the potential for the influence was there in that.
But
well, let me explain.
Potential doesn't mean a definite influence.
Well, let me explain. Well,
you're saying
let me explain.
Equals potential influence.
Let me explain. Now, let me explain. So there were some people, despite the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, bringing the religion of Islam. He didn't bring the religion of Islam, revealing the final message of our Creator, which is the only message of our Creator has been Islam from the very beginning. So let me clarify that. He didn't bring the religion of Islam. The religion of Islam has existed since the Prophet Adam, alayhi salatu wasalam. So, but the influence and it depends on what you mean by influence. Now, there were some people who, despite the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, bringing the message of the oneness of our Creator. Same thing happened to Abraham and Moses and Jesus, peace be upon him, all the other prophets. Despite that, the pagans still insisted on worshiping the gods of their tradition. And so, is there a potential influence? Did some people accept Islam? Did some people accept the message of Jesus? Did some people reject the message of Noah and Moses and all those things? Well, sure they did. Some people rejected, and so in that way, the pagan influence actually affected the people who rejected the truth in that regard. So obviously, there's a clear distinction between someone who accepts the truth and someone who rejects the truth. So the influence is always there. We see influence of paganism even today, with so-called false gods being worshipped in the form of money and women and merchandise. I'm not just directing women. Sometimes people are worshiping other human beings in various ways, having idols and all those things. So we still see pagan influence even today.
So we've established that proximity gives the possibility of a theological influence, but not a definite one. You would probably say that there's no pagan theology in Islam, right? Would you say that there's pagan theology in Judaism?
Well, absolutely. That's exactly what I've been arguing today.
Hold on, I'm finishing the question.
Okay, well, sure.
They would say Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, very similar to the Shahada. So this Eloheinu, they talk about our God, El, right? The word El is even in that, just like Allah, right, which you would say means the God. So the Allah or the Elohenu in these two monotheistic religions, how are each of them impacted by?
Okay, well, I think you're conflating the issue with modern times versus the point that I've made initially. I'm talking about the influence. Hold on.
What about
the influence that I'm talking about was on early Judaism. I'm not talking about Judaism as it's practiced today. obviously, the longer something's
because they use the same scripture.
What now?
What was the difference between early Judaism and Judaism as practiced today? Because they use the same scripture.
Well, unfortunately, we still, if you remember the verses that I had mentioned, we still see remnants of pagan influence in the scriptures themselves. So hold on, let me clarify. Because most people most likely don't know the information that I just gave. That doesn't mean that I'm some brilliant individual or anything like that. But what I'm stating is that most Jews, just as most Christians and sometimes most Muslims, have limited knowledge about scriptures. Hold on, they don't know where these things come from. They don't know the intricacies of it. And so what I've expressed here and what I've proven here today is that the influence of the pagan writings have you see absolute parallels in the Hebrew writings, the Hebrew Bible. You see,
you showed linguistic connections. Yeah,
we see we see parallels. As a matter of fact, if I've got to go back to it, matter of fact, I didn't even finish reading the last sheet of notes that I have that will clarify that, I assure you. But if I need to go back and if you want me to clarify that, I will prove my point. There's no question about it. Inshallah.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested in hearing the rest. So I do see the linguistic connections.
Okay, so let me clarify that.
Language.
No, it's more than the linguistics. Okay, it's deeper than that. So let's talk about that for a moment. Okay, so in regards to creation, we're going to be talking about the pagan writings of Enuma Elish versus Genesis, and so we're going to talk about 4 particular points, okay, based on the writings themselves. But what I'm trying to stress here is, once again, the influence of the pagan writings. Even in the Bible itself, we see the influence of the pagan writings. That's what I'm arguing right now. So we see a temporal clause that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the waters in particular, the movement of the waters. We're going to talk about wind sweeping across the water and also splitting of the water. So in regards to creation, in Enuma Elish, the reference is made when on high. In Genesis, it's when El began. So when on high and when El began, that's okay. So that's a little tricky. But in regards to the waters, the Tiamat, if you study the writings of the Tiamat, and also you'll see in Genesis, the Tiamat in the Enuma Elish, and in Genesis, the Tihan, which is a cognate of the Tiamat. Okay, so these are parallel terms that are being used there. So the winds being swept over the water. In the Enuma Elish, we see Marduk thrust the wind in her face. It says Marduk thrust the wind in her face. In Genesis, we see the same statement saying wind from El swept on the face of the water. So these are parallel verses that someone has actually gone through and created a parallel writing based on the earlier pagan writing. So splitting of the waters, and in Enuma Elish, it refers to the waters being split in half and establishing the heavens and the earth. And in Genesis, says the El made a dome dividing the waters and making the sky and the earth. And then in each of those writings, then afterward the land is created and then the humans are created. So we see parallels there, but that's not it. So mythologized depictions of gods have been replaced in Hebrew writings of the Bible with mythologized depictions of humans. So in the pagan writings, we had mythologized writings about the gods, and in the Hebrews, once again, as they were trying to separate themselves from those previous separate themselves from the signs of the previous influence, they turned the mythologized writings from writings about various gods into writings about humans. Okay, so in Wellhausen's theory, I don't know if you're familiar with Wellhausen's theory, but Wellhausen's theory states that the Torah is constituted of no less than 5 sources as described in his theory, and it's centered around the writings of J.E., P and JEP and also D. And most people are.
I have heard that. Yes.
You've heard that before, so that's Velhassen. Okay.
Oh
And
yeah, I didn't
so-
know the source, but the theory is, based on the way in which they call the name God, it shows different authorship in different parts.
Yeah. So what in his theory, what his hypothesis is, which is actually backed by.
You and I would both reject that because we both believe that that's authored by Abraham, right, or Moses.
No, I can't say that. No, I don't say that at all. Do I believe that the Torah is authored by Moses? No, I don't.
Okay.
No,
Go
I
ahead.
don't believe that at all, to be honest. So anyway, in regards to that, that's called the Pentateuch, and that whole theory regarding these writings, those 5 writings that are centered around Genesis and Exodus and Deuteronomy and Leviticus and the Book of Numbers. They all constitute the Pentateuch, and those stem from 5 writings of JEP, and writings of D. So, but that similar analysis was made in the 1600s by 3 other scholars, Baruch Spinoza, Thomas Hobbes, and also Jean Estruc, if I'm saying their names properly, Jean Estruc. Okay, so in all that, we see Yahweh was an anthropomorphic being forming a man from clay, and he walks in the evening and eats food of Abraham, and he stitches up clothes for Adam and Eve, and he's speaking to humans face to face. And these are signs in the book of E, actually known for use in the plural Elohim and fear of God. Anyway, so what I'm stating here is that these evidences do exist, and if you do read this book right here by Karen Armstrong, History of God, you'll see that she says the 3rd wave of Hebrew settlement occurred in about 1200 BCE when tribes who claimed to be descendants of Abraham arrived in Canaan from Egypt. And they said that they had been enslaved by the Egyptians but had been liberated by a deity called Yahweh, who was the God of their leader Moses. And after they forced their way into Canaan, they allied themselves with the Hebrews there and became known as the people of Israel. So these same Canaanites, okay, if you understand why I highlighted this, it says they said that they were enslaved by the Egyptians but had been liberated by the deity called Yahweh, who was the God of their leader Moses. After they had forced their way into Canaan, they allied themselves with the Hebrews there and became known as the people of Israel. The Bible makes it clear that the people who know the ancient Israelites were a confederation of various ethnic groups bound together principally by their loyalty to Yahweh, the God of Moses. It says the biblical account was written down centuries later. However, in about the 8th century BCE, okay, so it says, however, in about the 8th century BCE, though it certainly drew on earlier narrative sources. I didn't read that very well, but she's stating that these same Canaanites eventually became the Israelites. So you see the influence there. The influence was a part of their life, part of their ancestry. They eventually became the Israelites, and it says that the biblical account was written down centuries later. However, in about 8th century BCE, though it certainly drew on earlier narrative sources.
Yeah, she stated the opposite. So your conclusion is the opposite of the person that you're quoting.
No, I'm not. No, it's not exactly the same. No, understand what I'm saying. Let me read it clearly for you. It says the biblical account was written down centuries later. However, it drew from earlier narrative sources, which coincides with the argument that I've given. The whole argument that I've given about the parallels and the influence of the pagans and the pre-existing gods of El and Baal and Baal Habad and all those things, it all stemmed from early paganism, and it's these are scholars that are saying it's not just Kenny Bomer.
The scholar you quoted specifically says that the thing that unified them was their fidelity to Yahweh.
Yeah, right. That was eventually. That was, hold on, you're conflating the issue here. That was eventually, and that's where we stand today. Okay, we see very little pagan influence in Judaism today, other than there are some underlying things there, and that's too much to go into right now. But you know, for the most part, the Jews are worshiping our Creator, and that's it, and that's fine. Alhamdulillah. That's not what I'm arguing. I'm not talking about today. I'm talking about in our conversation from yesterday was based on the early pagan influence. Inevitably, I was trying to talk about the influence of paganism, polytheism on Christianity, and somehow I allowed you to lure me into the discussion that we're having today about early pagan influence on Judaism. That did happen. It does exist. We have signs of it. I encourage you to read this book and you'll find out all about it. And there's other sources that I didn't just get my information from this book, but it's clear that there was absolute influence on
early. I should have been specific on theological influence, because you're talking about two people groups intermingling to one people group. That doesn't necessitate any theological influence.
Well, sure it does. Well, sure it does. If one group, you know,
no, it doesn't.
Yes, it does. Absolutely, it does. I don't see how you can say otherwise.
Because it doesn't logically follow.
Let's put it like this. You're a polytheist, okay? You don't think that you're a polytheist. Well, respectfully, you're a polytheist. You don't think that you are, but you are, because you believe that God is three. You believe in the whole Elohim idea. Elohim, it means gods. It literally means gods, plural. Where did that stem from? It stemmed from paganism. The word existed in pagan the Canaanites. No. What I'm saying is that the influence that you've had from your people, right? It's there. It exists. That's why you believe what you believe. In the same way, now if you changed what you believe, then you would have stepped away from that influence. But the influence is there. The influence existed in my life, and I was, alhamdulillah, I was, I was blessed enough to be able to say, wait a minute, something's wrong here. I believe in the true oneness of our Creator. I don't believe that God has offspring, and I don't believe God turned himself into his own son and all those things. That's the other issue. But what I'm saying is the influence was there. You can't say that it wasn't. The influence of Christianity has existed in my life. I'll be 49 years old in April, and I still have the influence of Christianity. Even though I'm a Muslim, there's an influence everywhere around me. So to imply that it's not. So let me give you examples. As a Muslim, it'd be great to celebrate Christmas and to give gifts and all that those festivities and all those things, which all stem from paganism. But it'd be easy for me as a Muslim to get involved with that. As a matter of fact, I know Muslims personally who celebrate Christmas. Okay, I totally disagree with it, but that's between them and Allah. But the influence is there. So yes, the close proximity to people of other beliefs and other faiths and other religions most certainly has an influence on us, either good or bad. Either good or bad.
You didn't establish how. You
sometimes both.
Stated it to be the case.
Huh?
You didn't say how. You just stated it to be a fact.
Well, in various ways. Okay, the Muslims that are participating in Christian, in celebrating Christmas. Well, they're participating in a pagan ritual. Okay. I totally disagree with that. I don't think it's right. I don't think we need to be messing around with that. But they've been influenced in that regard. That doesn't mean that they're worshiping the Christian God, but if they're following that pagan ritual, they're doing it, for whatever reason. I'm using that as an example. That's
what I'm saying. You can't conclude the reason just based on the fact that
I'm not arguing the reason. I'm talking about the influence.
You're saying the reason is influence. And
no,
I'm saying
no, I'm not. I didn't say the reason is influence. Those words never came out of my mouth. What I said was that they have been influenced. If the Muslims are celebrating Christmas and they actually have a Christmas tree in their home and all those things, it doesn't mean that they're worshiping anyone other than Allah. I'm not saying that. That's not the argument that I'm making. But the influence of Christianity has been so prominent and so dominant and overwhelming that they have participated in practicing this pagan ritual. Think about what's happening here. Initially, it happened in paganism. Initially, it happened in paganism to the point that now the Christians are doing it. They adopted it into their religion. They're doing it, and then sometimes it affects even Jews. Sometimes people who are Jews, sometimes they'll even celebrate Christmas and have a Christmas tree and pass out gifts and all those things because it's
Right,
festive,
because
and
they're celebrating
that's a tactic
not
of
a
Satan.
religious day, but a secular national holiday.
Yeah. Well,
So
that's fine. We're talking about not just secular, but we're talking about religious influence. We're talking about writing influence in writings, which I've demonstrated here today.
you're saying
Influence
these things
of
have a
belief.
cultural influence, not a theological influence.
It is theological. It has every
How does it
potential.
theologically influence
It has every potential to be theological, and I've actually proved that.
potential? Okay, I'll concede for the purpose of our discussion and the fact that we're a half hour over time,
Okay.
that proximity does give rise to the potential for theological influence. I don't think that proves at all that that's taken place, but it's an interesting discussion.
Okay, well, it's
Yeah, your use of the word potential is something I can agree with.
okay. Let me just summarize with this right here. What she says. She says we are so familiar with the Bible story and the subsequent history of Israel that we tend to project our knowledge of later Jewish religion back onto early historical personages. She said, accordingly, we assume that the three patriarchs of Israel, Abraham, his son Isaac, and his grandson Jacob, were monotheists. Now, pay close attention. And I don't believe this, but she says, accordingly, we assume that the three patriarchs of Israel, Abraham, his son Isaac, and his grandson Jacob, were monotheists, that they believed in only one God. She's saying that's what we believe. She says, but she says, this does not seem to have been the case. Okay, she says this does not seem to have been the case. Indeed, it is probably more accurate to call these early Hebrew pagans, to call these people early Hebrew pagans who shared many of the religious beliefs of their neighbors in Canaan.
Yeah, I reject that, and I think you would too.
Well, I reject it, but the potential was there. I don't believe that the prophet Abraham, alayhi salatu wasalam, or Isaac, alayhi salatu wasalam, or Jacob, peace be upon them, I don't believe that they were pagans in any regard. I believe they were true monotheists. Now that's her opinion, but what I think she's trying to stress here is that the influence was there, which is why the final statement was,
or the potential for it that you and I have agreed on.
Well, yeah, okay. Well, if the potential is there for some people, it's a reality for others. Okay, it could easily be a reality for us. If I was around a bunch of Catholics, and they're eating the blood of drinking the blood of Jesus and eating his flesh and all those things, and I was around it long enough, the potential for me to accept it is there. For some people, they do accept it. Okay, so the influence is there. And there's no two ways about it. We influence one another. There's no disputing that.
So if I understand your argument goes like this. There was proximity. Proximity gives rise to the potential for a theological influence. And the potential necessarily leads to the fact that there will be some.
Well, absolutely.
Okay. I think it's fallacious.
You think it's fallacious? How can you say that based on the example that I just gave you about Muslims? Okay, that I personally know some Muslims who celebrate Christmas. Okay, so the potential is there. So I have the potential of the Christian influence. I'm just using this as an example. Okay, the potential for the influence of Christmas in Christianity to cause me to go get a tree and put it in my home and follow this original pagan practice, right? Okay, that's a potential. But for some people, some Muslims actually do this. Okay, so that's a reality. It's not just a potential. The potential is there for everyone. That's a given. But the reality is that some people accept it, some people reject it. But the influence is always there. There's no disputing the influence.
So let me ask if the same logic, well, actually we're out of time. Should I let you go, or should I close it up asking you a question about Islam?
I think we should keep going about 30, 35, 40 more minutes.
Okay, well, I have a question about Islam then. So if we're saying then that proximity gives rise to the potential of theological influence, and if their potential exists, then there is an eventual certainty that it will affect some people. That's what you're saying. Then if I were to open up sources, because you opened up sources, you said, here's what the Canaanites believed about Baal. right, and El. And then notice the distinct similarities to what's in the Hebrew and Christian books. And because of these similarities, you're saying there must be influence. So if we were to open up the oral traditions of everything that people point to in commonality with the Quran, whether that's the creation of dust into birds and Jesus giving life to birds, which predated Islam with other traditions, or the correlations with the Bible, right? The stories of Adam and Eve and Noah and so on. Would we say the same thing? Would we say,
I'm
hey,
so glad you asked that. That's a great question.
these two things seem to match, and
Yeah.
therefore one is derivative of the other?
No, that's a great question. I mean, that's a very respectful, that's a question that I had myself, right? And to answer it quite simply, I believe as a Muslim that Allah has sent a messenger of prophets to every nation on the earth and every group of people on the earth, and that the message has been the same. And I believe that the message has many times been altered and been changed, except for the Quran. Alhamdulillah, the Quran can't be changed. That's another issue. But I do believe that if there's previous writings that state that man was made from clay, if they stem from times of early pagans, that doesn't mean that the truth wasn't amongst the pagans. Okay, just as now, I would consider anyone who worships a God who they believe is three, I consider them pagans, because that's polytheism. Okay, so that doesn't mean that the truth doesn't exist amongst them, because obviously the truth and the beauty of Islam exists amongst pagans in a pagan world where people are worshiping so many different stones, so-called stones and statues, things that we make gods in this world, including other human beings, including the actual religions themselves that have those influences. But amongst that, the truth is always there. The truth has always existed. So if something's been revealed, such as Allah making Adam ﷺ from clay, and that's been revealed throughout the history of mankind, then we hold on to that. We accept that. The Quran confirms that. The Quran is al-Furqan, the criterion between what's right and what's wrong. It's al-Muhaymin, which is sets the precedence for the same thing, for what's to be accepted and what's to be rejected. And so, we accept those things. I have no problem with that.
Would you apply the same logic to the evidence that you showed today?
I apply the logic to the fact that, just as I mentioned that we have the potential for pagan influence today, there's actual true pagans today that exist, literal pagans, not just the polytheists that are in Christianity in my mind, but true pagans that worship stones and statues. They exist today. So despite that, in former times, in ancient times, as in modern times, the influence is always there. This is a direct attacks from Satan, causing us to worship things of the world and other people and all those things instead of focusing on our Creator. That's existed from day one. I mean, that's why Moses, peace be upon him, was dealing with pagans, and Abraham, peace be upon him, was dealing with pagans. Jesus, peace be upon him, was dealing with pagans, and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was dealing with pagans. It's always existed. It always will exist until the day of judgment, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to show us who was right and wrong in these matters. Alhamdulillah.
You may have misunderstood my question, though.
I don't think so.
When I ask if the same logic applies to the evidence you presented today, I mean it this way. You would look at the commonalities between what Muhammad taught and oral traditions that predated Muhammad as evidence that some of the people who gave those old oral traditions had some little slivers of the truth, right?
Sure.
Okay. Would you apply the same sliver of truth logic to the commonalities between the Hebrew God and the traditions before him? So if the Canaanites called their God El, and if the Hebrews called their God El, would you say, well, maybe the Canaanites had a sliver of truth?
Well, yeah, it could be. I mean, if they're worshiping an ultimate God, yeah, absolutely. I believe they had a sliver of truth, but that has nothing to do with our discussion in regards to the main topic.
Well, it doesn't.
Was there influence on
If that's
the
true, they
Israelite?
might both be influenced by by God, and not be influenced by one another.
Uh, it could be. I mean, inevitably, um, you know, you and I both agree that we have one creator. Okay,
Yes.
your concept of
You
our
called
creator,
me
mine
a
mine is
polytheist,
two
but I
different.
do agree
That's
there's
a
one
different issue.
creator.
We believe that there's one creator. I believe in the full oneness of our creator. You believe
Me
in an
too.
altered version of that. But nevertheless, alhamdulillah. But
All right. So
nevertheless,
it's been interesting though.
nevertheless,
You've given me stuff to
as I
consider
mentioned
that I
from my
haven't seen
notes,
before, and it's been great. I really appreciate it.
what'd you say?
I said it's been interesting. You've given me stuff to consider that I haven't seen before, and I really appreciate it.
Alhamdulillah. Well, it's this is not my area of expertise by no means. Not that I have
Neither is it mine.
an area of expertise. I'm not implying that I do. But what I'm saying is that this is we're encouraged to seek knowledge, and it was just another opportunity for me to dig a little deeper and try to come with the evidence, and I think I've done that.
That's to all of our benefit. I would say this: if any Muslims or Christians, atheists or Jews or Hindus, or if anybody watches this, it never hurts to dig deeper, right? And one shouldn't fear the fact that they're going to uncover something that shatters their worldview. If you do uncover something that shatters your worldview, you should have never held that worldview in the first place. I always use the comparison to money, right? And Kenny, you will have heard this before.
I don't know if I agree with what you just stated, but go ahead.
Okay. Well,
Sometimes our worldview needs to be shattered.
that's so you and I are agree. That's essentially what I was saying.
Yeah.
So I'll use the comparison to money, and this is, oh shoot. And with that, I'll let you go because I'm getting that conference call that I was waiting for.
Okay.
So it's been great to talk to you. It's fine if you wrap up the.
All right, well, tell your preacher to call me so I can deal with him next time.
Yeah, right. All right.
All right. Assalamu alaikum. All right. Alhamdulillah. Okay, so alhamdulillah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our efforts. May bless A.K. Manning. I do have love for him. We did get to meet in person a couple of months back or whatever it was, a few weeks back, more than a few weeks, but we've been engaging one another for over 3 years at this point, and I enjoy talking with him. Sometimes it gets a little heated, but we do have love for one another, and that's I believe he cares about me, and I certainly care about him. But this is all about truth. We're trying to find the truth, and I believe that I have found the truth in Islam. I don't see the issues in Islam that I've seen in Christianity, or I don't have a whole lot of knowledge about Judaism, but alhamdulillah, there's nothing in Islam that I question. I know that it's the truth from our Creator, and alhamdulillah, I'm so grateful that He led me to Islam a little over 32 years ago at this point, alhamdulillah. So, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive me for any mistakes that I made, and may He accept my efforts. And during this discussion, I pray that if it affects people in any positive way, certainly it comes from Allah and Allah alone, and may He accept my intentions behind it. So please, if you would, once again, please give to the Kenny Bomer Foundation for the dawah that we're working on and the things that we have coming up for this platform, as well as other projects. And it's all centered around what we're doing, trying to strive in the cause of Allah and trying to share Islam with people in any way that we can. Some of the dawah fund will go to help me get my book published and those things, pay for the editing and proofreading and all of those things. So if you'd like to help in that regard, anyone that is affected in a positive way, you will also get blessings for that, inshallah, God willing. Allah blesses us for our intention. So once again, this is Kenny Bomer Live on Consider This TV, where truth is made clear from falsehood. I thank you for watching and listening, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you and your families, and may He guide us all to better understanding and more truth and wisdom and how to apply that to our lives. And so, alhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen, I do bear witness there's no God other than Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is His final servant, the seal of all prophets. La ilaha illallah, wa shadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله